And so just another issue that Stephen brought up, he said that basically the reading of Theodore Beza from his 1582 only really lasted about 30 years, and then it was changed. And people didn't really run with it. They went back to the original readings of the earlier Textus Receptus.
Within that, there's really only a 30-year tradition, maybe a few additional years because of Elzevir 1633. Most of the time we talk about, well, this is the received text, the text that's been received by all. But out of those 200 years, really less than 40 years of it was actually accepting the reading that is esomenos. Most TR traditional years of acceptance before Beza and after Beza accepted the reading, not just esomenos for that short time, but most of the time it was actually hagios.
And later, the early versions of the Elzevir, nephew and uncle, they did not have this, but then they inserted it later, once again, to parallel with the King James. But Mills followed Stephanus on this in 1707. Many of the years and years and years of the TR tradition did not accept this. Most years that the TR has existed, the writers and editors did not accept this reading. This is a Beza issue. And so Beza inserted this in 1582. It followed his tradition to 1598, which is one of the main sources for the King James translators.
And so while I would acknowledge, anyone would acknowledge, that the reading of Theodore Beza at 1582 was the year that he understood that it was a noun phrase. He understood that it's related to Jehovah. He understood, and he might have understood that long before, and other people might have understood. And I actually teach, and in my book, and believe that the Greeks understood this, that they understood that it was a holy name of God. Just like the Jews today, they understand that when they see the name Adonai, they know it's the name Jehovah, but they're not allowed to say it, So the holy, sacred names of God, if you look into the sacred names, if you look into how it's translated in the Old Testament and things like that, and brought over into other translations or how it's spoken, Jews won't say the name. And so the whole issue of it being a 30-year period is just ridiculous, because obviously he does state, it was just a tradition that was carried over with the King James. Well, of course, the King James was the most popular Bible, and one of the things that I brought up in the debate was that, the King James is basically an edition of the TR. And so this is what Westcott and Hort, they thought this. And so obviously Ellicott, who was running the translation committee, he had commissioned certain things to be done. So he commissioned Scrivener to do the 1881 edition of the Greek so that they could accurately point out how much they've deviated from the text underlying the King James Version. Now, the closest text up until that time was probably the text of Theodore Beza. As far as I know, I'm not sure if anyone else between Beza and Scrivener had attempted to do any more updates to gravitate further toward the King James. But what we see is the text of Scrivener, he basically went and created the text that the King James translators never got around to doing or weren't commissioned themselves to do. They were just to do an English translation. They weren't to do Greek side projects or anything like that in the King's name or anything like that. They were just to create an English Bible. Now, had they created a parallel Greek, they would have done Scrivener out of a job 250 years later, and there would be no TR or KJV only movements. There would just be King James and the parallel text. They would be the same, because words that read the same are the same. They equal each other. The King James Version is an edition of the TR. So when he's saying, I just become this English tradition, it's like, well, yeah, that's a TR edition. Even the Westcott and Hort Translation Committee understood that, and they commissioned Scrivener to make his text, understanding that it's the underlying Greek text of the King James. And so that's the text that they were looking at. And when Stephen says it's only a 30-year period, he's basically looking at, between the time of 1582 of Theodore Beza when he first put this into his text, up until, say, the time of the Elzevirs, the 1633. I mean, 30, 40 years there sort of thing. But when you look at the other Bibles that Theodore Beza did with Janius and Tremellius, Beza, Janius, Tremellius, they created the most popular Latin edition that was unparalleled for like 300 years that had Theodore Beza's reading in it of et eris, which is a Latin for esomenos. And so basically it has the triadic declaration there. And so in the Latin, it's there. In the English, so all the popular Bibles had it. So when we look at the States Bible, the Dutch States Bible, it was in there as well. And so it was being translated. It was being used. What Stephen seems to do is he jumps over to Mill, 1707 Mill. And so I sort of answer this a little bit, but Mill he just went with the 1550. And that's just like the guys who did the London polyglot, Walton's polyglot. They just had the 1550 Greek. So they just went with that, and they had marginal notes basically saying what the other TR editions had, because 1550 had just become a standard in a sense. And so, but when you look at, if this reading just fell out of practice, no. And the thing is too, it's like these editions were being published. Beza's edition was getting republished. So was the text of the Elzevir family. The 1633, that was continually republished. And to say that just fizzed out is not accurate. We have a lot of information about how these texts were accepted. And so one of the conclusions that I came to when I was writing the book, because I wanted to see how it was accepted by translators and people making commentaries in that day, and I found that most people were just saying, yes, that's true, and they weren't debating against it. So Stephen's sort of making out that as if people just went, let's just forget that. And he's also making out as if, because later on, after Mill, the Textus Receptus, the whole concept of new editions of the Textus Receptus just basically stopped because they had nailed it. And people were recognizing that the Textus Receptus underlying the King James Version was the text. And so the text that matched up with that, Theodore Beza's text, the text of Stephanus, it matched up to a certain degree. But, scholars were using that. People were looking at this and they were accepting it. Just Google Theodore Beza's Greek, and it's there. It's online. It's being reprinted quite regularly. And so to say that it fizzed out or it faded out, it's just making this up. It's having a cursory look at the information. Now, Stephen needs to look into this more and to see if it was rejected. Because I've looked at a lot of texts, a lot of Greek texts, and they follow Beza on this reading. And many people point back to Theodore Beza for the reason why they have it in their text. And so to just say that it's just phased out, a 30-year period, that I don't know where he got that from. It looks like he's just had a cursory reading of Textus Receptus to the King James, and then it's just the King James after that. Well, the Latin of Theodore Beza, obviously the King James, the English, the Elzevirs after him, and the thing is too, Theodore Beza's that's his final edition, and so in a sense where there wasn't hardly any changes in it. In any other of his printed editions that he did. And so we're looking at his final edition. So it's like if we did a whole bunch of English translations up until the King James, just because, some people go back and buy a Geneva Bible and all the rest of it, doesn't mean that the King James isn't still popular, isn't still used, or isn't still a standard. And so I think it just seems like an argument that's not worth making. It just seems like something he's made up in his mind. He's gone, it's only a small period of time that this is popular. No, this is still very popular today. In the Trinitarian Bible Society are still printing editions, language editions with this in it. They're following this reading. They're not rejecting it. And so I think that needs to be taken into consideration.
Within that, there's really only a 30-year tradition, maybe a few additional years because of Elzevir 1633. Most of the time we talk about, well, this is the received text, the text that's been received by all. But out of those 200 years, really less than 40 years of it was actually accepting the reading that is esomenos. Most TR traditional years of acceptance before Beza and after Beza accepted the reading, not just esomenos for that short time, but most of the time it was actually hagios.
And later, the early versions of the Elzevir nephew and uncle, they did not have this, but then they inserted it later, once again, to parallel with the King James. But Mills followed Stephanus on this in 1707. Many of the years and years and years of the TR tradition did not accept this. Most years that the TR has existed, the writers and editors did not accept this reading. This is a Beza issue. And so Beza inserted this in 1582. It followed his tradition to 1598, which is one of the main sources for the King James translators.